depending on where the cell is in its life cycle, it may not trigger premature apoptosis. The message from the messenger RNA goes to the DNA and says, we're under siege. Close down those active transport channels. And instead of the mitochondria triggering apoptosis, the cell goes through normal mitosis, which is normal cell division. And when that happens, the genetic material that was changed by the messenger RNA goes to the daughter cells. So now you have daughter cells that think that they're under siege. And then those daughter cells duplicate with the bad genetic information. And as that process continues, you have something called electrosensitivity. So that electrosensitivity is an environmentally induced genetic change. And when a person is electrosensitive, they will react in an allergic manner to any exposure to an electromagnetic field. That's why you have people who are electrosensitive who can sense a cell phone call before the phone rings. And that's why you have some people who are electrosensitive who can walk into a room and have such a splitting headache because there's Wi-Fi in the room that they can't stay there. Here's what the problem is. We run a registry in the Safe Wireless Initiative, and that registry is there to collect symptoms from people who believe they have been harmed by cell phones or other sources of electromagnetic radiation. When we began the registry in 2002, we had 1 million people visit the registry within the first 2 months. And almost all of the complaints had to do with cell phones. Almost all of them had to do with cell phones. In the past 6 months, almost all of the complaints in our registry have to do with electrosensitivity. Now, in the old days, 5 years ago, we were mainly concerned about the area 6 or 7 inches around the cell phone antenna. We called that the near-field radiation plume. And we were concerned about that because the power necessary to carry the signal to a base station resulted in a plume that had a high concentration of information-carrying radio waves. And that's why we recommended that people use headsets to move the antenna away so that they were 6 or 7 inches beyond the near-field plume, and that would mitigate the risk. Today, in most major cities in the world, the difference in concentration of information-carrying radio waves in the area right next to the cell phone antenna and the background is almost not discernible. In some places like Toronto, in the last 5 years, the concentration of information-carrying radio waves has increased 500,000 times. Now, in that effect window, where we have in milliseconds recognition and then in 3 to 5 seconds, interpretation of harm, and then in 30 seconds to a couple of minutes, the process of shutting down active transport. In that window, there is no threshold. What that means is that there is no safe level of exposure to information-carrying radio waves. In the lower window, where you're talking about the electromagnetic fields, the extremely low frequency coming from electrical outlets, there is a threshold. And up at the high window, where you have X-rays and gamma rays, there is a threshold, meaning that there is a level of exposure where the body's compensation mechanism is greater than the amount of damage done. But in the RF effect window, there is no safe level. That means that if you have one cell exposed to an information-carrying radio wave, it goes through that process of recognition, interpretation, and going through the process of self-preservation and protection. There is no safe level. Now, $15, $20 years ago, there were information-carrying radio waves. Remember in the old days when we used to have these TVs with those antennas on the top of the house? And then there was an antenna on the top of a mountain. And what it did was it sent an information-carrying radio wave from the antenna on the mountain to the antenna on your house. And then it converted it into some type of hardwire communication, and it went to your television. So there were information-carrying radio waves. But you weren't exposed to them because they were up in the air. Every time you make a cell phone call, you are bringing those information-carrying radio waves down to Earth. Every time you make a call, you're bringing that clothesline with the clothes and the wave down to the street. And what that means is that exposure today to information-carrying radio waves is almost unavoidable. It's almost unavoidable. Now, we understand a great deal now about the mechanism of harm. We understand that there are 3 windows. We understand that the RF window, there's no threshold. We understand that the problem is triggered initially by something that happens at the cell membrane level. We understand that the disruption of intercellular communication is something that happens secondarily to that recognition. We understand that if that damage continues, that it changes the genetic material of the cell. And it carries it on to daughter cells. And that's why we have electrosensitivity, and that's why we have autism, and that's why we have those other self-propagating conditions. Now, do you ever wonder what scientists think about when they go to bed? Well, it isn't what you think. We go to bed wondering about what if we could stop that damage happening at the cell membrane level? And what if we could restore all of that intercellular communication? And if we can do that, then we can reverse